November 1945. Inside the vast, cold halls of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the defeated leaders of the Third Reich were seated in the dock, men whose decisions had reshaped the world and left entire nations in ruins. For the first time in modern history, generals, ministers, and architects of state policy were forced to answer for the destruction they had unleashed. The Allied powers had gathered not simply to punish individuals, but to establish a new standard for justice after a war marked by unprecedented brutality. Yet, in the middle of these solemn proceedings, an unexpected moment occurred, one that startled observers and continues to raise questions even decades later. A single technical mishap produced a strange scene, the defendants laughing openly in court.
In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Allied powers faced a crucial question. How should they deal with the leaders of the defeated Third Reich? Previous wars had ended with exiled monarchs or negotiated settlements, but this conflict was different. The scale of destruction, the systematic nature of the killings, and the deliberate targeting of civilian populations demanded a new approach. The Soviet Union initially advocated for summary proceedings followed by immediate formal punishment. The British government considered similar measures. But the American delegation, led by Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, argued for a different path. They insisted on a proper trial, with legal representation, rules of evidence, and the presumption of innocence until guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt. The Americans made their position clear from the outset. The primary objective was not merely to punish individuals, but to condemn militarism itself as a threat to civilization. In their opening statement, the prosecution declared that militarism inevitably leads to a cynical disregard for the rights of others and the fundamental principles of civilized society. Militarism destroys the moral foundations of the people who practice it, they argued. And because it can only be defeated by force of arms, it undermines the morals of those compelled to fight against it. This philosophical foundation shaped everything that followed. The tribunal would not be a show trial or an act of vengeance. It would be, in theory at least, an impartial examination of evidence, leading to verdicts based on law rather than political expediency. The defendants would have access to legal counsel. They could request documents. They could present witnesses in their defense. 3 defendants would ultimately be acquitted, despite strong objections from the Soviet delegation. Despite the gravity of the charges, the 22 men in the dock maintained a remarkable composure throughout much of the trial. They had reasons for their confidence, or perhaps their denial. They believed that the emerging tensions between their former enemies would work in their favor. The wartime alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union was already showing signs of strain. The defendants, particularly Hermann Göring and Alfred Rosenberg, calculated that disagreements among the Allied powers would prevent unanimous verdicts on capital punishment. Rosenberg specifically hoped that the Western powers would vote against the death penalty, sparing his life. Their defense attorneys adopted an unusual strategy. Rather than vigorously contesting the evidence of their clients' involvement in specific crimes, they instead challenged the legal basis and legitimacy of the tribunal itself. This was classic courtroom tactics aimed at delay. The longer they could draw out proceedings, the more time they had for tensions among the Allies to escalate. Perhaps they hoped the tribunal would collapse before verdicts could be rendered. The defendants also relied heavily on what would become known as the superior orders defense. They argued that Adolf Hitler had been the supreme authority, issuing commands that they, as soldiers and civil servants, were oath-bound to obey. In their view, they were merely following orders. The responsibility, they insisted, lay with the Führer alone.
This calculated approach meant that even as witnesses took the stand and described horrific events in vivid detail, the defendants remained relatively calm. They sat in their chairs, listened through their headphones to simultaneous translations, and maintained the demeanor of men who believed they still had options, still had hope.
Then came a moment that shattered their composure. The prosecution announced that Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus would testify. The reaction in the defendant's dock was immediate and confused. Paulus was dead. They were certain of it. The official German records showed he had died at Stalingrad. Hitler himself had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal and ceremonially placed a marshal's baton on his coffin. When the announcement was made, the defendants stirred. Some smiled. They whispered among themselves. What theatrical stunt was the Soviet prosecution attempting? Who would they parade into the courtroom claiming to be the deceased Field Marshal? Then Friedrich Paulus walked into the courtroom, very much alive, very much prepared to testify. The effect was instantaneous. The defendant sat in stunned silence. Hermann Göring, who had maintained an air of superiority throughout the proceedings, suffered what observers described as a nervous breakdown. The psychological impact was profound. If Paulus had survived, if the Soviets had kept him alive all this time, what else did they know? What other surprises awaited? Paulus took the stand and delivered testimony that directly contradicted one of the defense's key arguments. He described in detail the planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He spoke calmly and precisely about receiving the preliminary operational plan on September 3, 1940, shortly after joining the German High Command. When the plan was developed in the autumn of 1940, Paulus testified, there was no knowledge of any preparations on the Russian side. When I entered service at the High Command on September 3rd, I found an unfinished preliminary operational plan for an attack on the Soviet Union, designated by the codename Barbarossa. Colonel General Halder handed this plan to me for analysis of offensive operational possibilities, taking into account terrain conditions, force utilization, supply requirements, and so forth, assuming the availability of 130 to 140 divisions. These words demolished the popular defensive claim that Germany had attacked the Soviet Union preemptively, fearing Soviet aggression. Paulus made clear that the invasion had been planned months in advance, when Germany was still officially at peace with Moscow, and that no evidence of Soviet preparations for war had existed at that time. Perhaps this was the moment when the defendants began to realize that the trial might not end as they had hoped. The evidence was too substantial, the witnesses too credible, the Allied cooperation, despite underlying tensions, too solid.
The photograph that captured the defendants laughing has puzzled observers for decades. How could men facing such serious charges display such apparent levity? The answer reveals something about the nature of the trial itself and the unprecedented technical arrangements that made it possible. The Nuremberg Tribunal pioneered the use of simultaneous translation in a major legal proceeding. Every judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and defendant wore headphones. Teams of translators worked in soundproof booths, rendering testimony and arguments into Russian, English, German, and French in real time. This allowed the trial to proceed without the lengthy pauses that would have been required for consecutive translation. Soviet journalist Boris Polovoy, who covered the trial extensively and published his observations in a volume called Nuremberg Diaries, described the system in detail. Each participant could hear everything said by judges, prosecutors, attorneys, witnesses, and defendants in their native language. The attorneys also had assistants who could be summoned to retrieve documents or provide additional information. The system included a crucial feature. Each attorney had a microphone with an on-off switch. When speaking to assistants about document retrieval, they could turn off the microphone to avoid interrupting the proceedings or broadcasting their requests to the entire courtroom. On this particular day, Alfred Rosenberg's defense attorney needed a document. He clicked his microphone off, or thought he did, and asked his assistant for a specific file. The assistant, either mishearing the request or misunderstanding which document was needed, handed the attorney a book instead. Not just any book, but Rosenberg's own work, The Myth of the 20th Century, which had served as a philosophical foundation for the ideology of racial superiority that underpinned so much of what the defendants were accused of enabling. The attorney's reaction was immediate. Seeing his assistant holding up this particular book, in full view of the court, he lost his composure. Forgetting that his microphone was still on, he shouted at his assistant. The word he used, roughly translated, meant fool or idiot. Then he added, "Why are you showing me this?" The outburst was transmitted through every headphone in the courtroom. Judges heard it, prosecutors heard it, most importantly, the defendants heard it. The absurdity of the moment, the attorney's visible panic at being associated with Rosenberg's work, even as he defended Rosenberg himself, struck the defendants as darkly humorous. They laughed. The photographer captured this moment. The image shows most of the defendants in genuine mirth. What it does not capture is Alfred Rosenberg's own expression. According to eyewitness accounts, Rosenberg was furious. While his co-defendants found humor in his attorney's blunder, Rosenberg understood the implications. His own defense counsel was embarrassed to be publicly associated with his writings. This incident, preserved forever in that photograph, reveals something about the defendant's psychological state. Even facing overwhelming evidence, even hearing devastating testimony, they could still find moments of levity. Whether this represented genuine confidence, psychological denial, or simply the human need for relief from constant tension remains a matter of interpretation. As the trial progressed through 1946, the weight of evidence became undeniable. Survivors testified, documents were presented in meticulous detail, film footage was shown. The systematic nature of the crimes became impossible to dispute. Yet even after the verdicts were announced, not a single defendant expressed genuine remorse or acknowledged full responsibility for the crimes committed under the regime they had served. Their reactions ranged from defiance to denial, to attempts at self-justification. Hermann Goering's response was characteristic. "I do not recognize the authority of this court," he declared. "I remain loyal to our Führer." Goering had maintained throughout the trial that he was a soldier and politician who had served his country. He rejected the tribunal's jurisdiction and its right to judge him. Days after his sentence was announced, before it could be carried out, Goering ended his own life in his cell, robbing the tribunal of its most prominent defendant at the moment of formal punishment. Rudolf Hess, sentenced to life imprisonment, offered an even more grandiose justification. "Let us wait 20 years," he said. "Germany will rise again. Whatever sentence this court passes on me, I will be recognized as innocent before Christ. I am prepared to repeat everything again, even if it means being burned alive." This statement revealed not only Hess's continued commitment to the ideology that had led to such destruction, but also his complete inability to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. The defendants' refusal to accept guilt stemmed from several sources. Some genuinely believed they had acted as patriots serving their nation. Others convinced themselves that they had merely followed orders and therefore bore no personal responsibility. Many hoped that history would eventually vindicate them, that future generations would see them as victims of political vengeance rather than perpetrators of systematic crimes.
The verdict sparked strong reactions across defeated Germany, particularly among former military officers. Many in the Wehrmacht leadership felt that the manner of formal punishment dishonored the condemned men as soldiers. Colonel Kruger, a former Wehrmacht officer, expressed particular outrage.
I do not understand how the world could reach a point where state leaders and prominent government figures cannot die a proper soldier's death, but must be hung like dogs, he wrote. The condemned generals were punished too harshly. The acquittal of Schacht, von Papen, and Fritzsche was just. These men were guilty of nothing. This statement reveals the persistence of the old military code of honor that distinguished between death by firing squad, considered appropriate for soldiers, and death by hanging, traditionally reserved for common criminals. Kruger and others like him could not or would not accept that their leaders had been convicted not as soldiers who had fought and lost, but as individuals who had ordered and enabled crimes that transcended the bounds of warfare. Other reactions were more cynical. A former officer of the Hungarian army offered his analyses of why certain defendants received life sentences rather than death. England and America did well to keep Hess, he observed. He gave them much material while imprisoned. He will be treated well because America and England may use him in the future for the restoration of fascism in Germany. This comment reflected a widespread belief among some former Axis officers that the emerging Cold War would rehabilitate certain Nazi figures. They believed that Western powers would eventually need German anti-communist expertise and would therefore soften their stance toward former regime members. Perhaps most revealing was the comparison made by former Wehrmacht soldier Schuster, who invoked historical precedent. "We did not expect such a verdict," he said. "Napoleon, after his defeat, was exiled to an island but was not sentenced to death. This sentence was sought only by Russia." This comparison to Napoleon Bonaparte demonstrates a profound misunderstanding of the nature of the crimes prosecuted at Nuremberg. Napoleon had been a military conqueror whose ambitions led to widespread warfare. But the charges at Nuremberg went beyond aggressive war. They included systematic policies of persecution, the operation of facilities designed for mass killing, and the deliberate destruction of entire communities. These were not the acts of a traditional military leader, but of a regime that had industrialized inhumanity.
The Nuremberg Trials established principles that would shape international law for generations. The tribunal rejected the notion that heads of state and government officials were immune from prosecution for their actions. It established that following orders was not an absolute defense when those orders clearly violated fundamental human rights. It codified crimes against humanity as a distinct category of international law. The trials also demonstrated that even in the immediate aftermath of total war, when emotions ran high and cause for vengeance was strong, it was possible to conduct legal proceedings that adhered to basic standards of justice. The defendants received legal counsel. They could present evidence and call witnesses. Some were acquitted. The proceedings were public, documented, and subject to scrutiny. Yet the trials also revealed the limitations of law in addressing the full scope of what had occurred. How could any legal proceeding adequately address the destruction of entire communities? How could sentences, even death sentences, balance the scales of justice when the crimes encompassed millions of victims? These questions have no simple answers. The Nuremberg trials were not perfect. They were criticized then and continue to be debated by scholars. Some argued that the tribunal represented victors' justice, that the Allied powers were prosecuting their enemies, while ignoring their own potential violations of international law. Others contended that the legal principles applied were created after the fact, violating the principle that individuals should not be prosecuted under laws that did not exist when their actions occurred. Despite these criticisms, the Nuremberg trials established a precedent. They demonstrated that political and military leaders could be held accountable for their actions. They created a body of evidence that made denial of systematic atrocities more difficult.
They established legal principles that would be invoked in subsequent tribunals addressing crimes in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and other locations where similar horrors occurred. The trials also served an educational function. The extensive documentation, the witness testimony, and the detailed examination of evidence created an historical record that could not easily be dismissed or forgotten. For those willing to examine it, the trial transcripts and evidence provided undeniable proof of what had occurred.
Among the most controversial aspects of the Nuremberg trials was the question of appropriate punishment. For those convicted of the most serious crimes, the tribunal imposed death sentences. But how should such sentences be carried out? The decision to use hanging rather than firing squads outraged many former German military officers who saw it as a deliberate dishonoring of men they still considered soldiers. This reaction reveals how deeply ingrained military culture's hierarchies and codes remained even after the collapse of the regime. Some observers at the time suggested that the condemned should face the same methods they had authorized against others. The source document hints at this perspective, noting that the condemned could have been offered the choice of methods used in the facilities they had overseen. This approach would have represented a form of poetic justice, but it would also have reduced the tribunal to the level of those it judged. The Allies ultimately chose hanging as a deliberate statement. These men were not being treated as prisoners of war, entitled to military courtesies. They were convicted criminals whose crimes violated the most fundamental principles of civilization. The method of formal punishment reflected this judgment. The Nuremberg trials concluded in October 1946, with sentences for 19 defendants and acquittals for 3. The proceedings lasted 10 months and produced transcripts that filled thousands of pages. The evidence presented included millions of documents and hundreds of hours of testimony. The photograph of laughing defendants, which seemed so inappropriate and puzzling, turned out to document a moment of human absurdity in the midst of one of history's most serious legal proceedings. It serves as a reminder that even in circumstances of profound gravity, human nature asserts itself in unexpected ways. But beyond that single moment, the Nuremberg trials established principles that remain relevant today. They affirmed that government officials and military leaders are not above the law. They established that systematic persecution of civilian populations constitutes a crime that transcends national borders and sovereign immunity. They demonstrated that the international community has both the authority and the responsibility to address such crimes. The trials were not perfect. They could not undo the damage that had been done. They could not bring back those who had been killed. They could not fully heal the wounds inflicted on survivors and nations. But they established a framework for justice that acknowledged the gravity of what had occurred and attempted to respond in a manner consistent with the principles of law rather than pure vengeance. Today, international criminal tribunals continue the work begun at Nuremberg. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, prosecutes individuals for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Its existence and its authority to prosecute even heads of state stems directly from the precedents established in that courtroom in Germany in 1945 and 1946. The men who laughed in that famous photograph believed they might escape justice through legal technicalities or political developments. They were wrong. The evidence was too substantial, the crimes too grave, and the commitment to accountability too strong. Their laughter, captured by chance through a technical mishap, became a historical footnote to proceedings that fundamentally changed how the world addresses systematic atrocities. The Nuremberg trials remind us that justice, though imperfect and sometimes slow, remains essential. They demonstrate that even after the most destructive conflict in human history, it is possible to respond with law rather than lawlessness, with evidence rather than emotion, with accountability rather than impunity. As we reflect on these events now, decades later, we can see them as both a specific response to particular crimes and a broader statement about human civilization. They affirm that there are standards of behavior that transcend national boundaries, political ideologies, and military expediency. They establish that violating these standards will bring consequences, even for the most powerful individuals. The legacy of Nuremberg continues to shape our world. It influences how we think about international law, human rights, and the responsibilities of leadership. It stands as evidence that humanity, even in its darkest hours, retains the capacity to demand justice and accountability. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations of pivotal moments in history that shaped our modern world.